The encounter. The summer heat was unbearable as Elijah Carter strode down the sun-scorched streets of Lexington. Sweat gathered at his brow, trickling down his temple as the relentless midday sun beat down on him. He had just completed an errand at the local pharmacy, a quick stop to pick up a prescription for his mother. As a man of routine and simplicity, the errand had been uneventful, but the oppressive weather weighed heavily on him. He longed for the cool, air-conditioned office that awaited him inside the courthouse, just a few blocks ahead. As Elijah walked down the street, mind preoccupied with his next task, his senses suddenly sharpened. He heard a faint, panicked voice in the distance, calling out for help. "Help! Is there anyone there? Please." The voice cried out, frantic and tinged with distress. Elijah's instincts kicked in. The call for help didn't sound like a minor inconvenience. It was urgent, desperate. His heart rate quickened, and without hesitation, he changed direction, veering toward the alleyway behind a small grocery store on the corner. When he rounded the corner, he saw the source of the distress. An elderly woman, likely in her late 70s, stood by a parked car in the parking lot, patting her pockets frantically. Her hands trembled, and she cast frantic glances under the vehicles around her, her face contorted with anxiety. She was clearly searching for something, but her confusion and fear were palpable. Elijah took a few steps forward, drawn by her desperation. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called gently, making sure his tone was calm to avoid startling her further. "Can I help you?" The woman spun around, her eyes wide with relief as they locked onto him. Her voice was shaky, and her words spilled out in a hurried rush. "Oh, thank God you're here. I'd lost my wallet, young man. I don't know where it went, but I had it just a moment ago. I can't find it anywhere. I need it. My bus fare, my IDs, everything's in there." Elijah took a step closer, his brow furrowing in concern. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of losing something that she couldn't afford to lose. She appeared to be in her late 70s, a fragile figure whose hands trembled with the weight of more than just panic. It was the kind of helplessness that stirred something deep within him. Without a second thought, he bent down on the hot asphalt, the heat from the pavement searing through his pants, and began scanning the ground around them. "Don't worry, ma'am," Elijah reassured her, his voice steady and comforting. "I'll find it for you." He moved slowly, methodically, his eyes combing the parking lot with careful precision. He knew the area was busy, and it wouldn't be easy to spot the missing wallet amidst all the clutter. But Elijah had learned to be patient. His job as a public defender often required him to sift through evidence, trace stories back to their roots, and piece together fragmented truths. This moment felt no different. He focused on the task at hand, blocking out the harsh noise of the street. Minutes passed. The elderly woman continued to pace nervously, wringing her hands, occasionally muttering to herself. The occasional car rolled by, but none of them seemed to notice the distress unfolding in the parking lot. But Elijah's calm presence seemed to settle the air around her. He continued searching the ground, moving inch by inch, feeling the heat of the asphalt through his clothes. Then, as if by fate, his gaze fell upon something small and brown, wedged between two tires under a nearby car. A weathered leather wallet. It wasn't the shiny, brand-new kind. This one had seen years of use. The corners were frayed, the edges worn, and it looked as if it had traveled with its owner through countless experiences. Elijah's pulse quickened slightly, but he remained calm. He reached down, carefully retrieving the wallet, and rose to his feet. "Is this it?" Elijah asked gently, holding the wallet out to the woman. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief as she saw the worn leather item in Elijah's hand. She stumbled toward him, her hands trembling with gratitude. "Oh, my goodness, yes," she exclaimed, her voice cracking with emotion. "That's it. That's my wallet. Thank you so much, young man. I don't know what I would have done without you." Elijah smiled softly, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. It wasn't much, just a simple act of kindness, but seeing the relief flood the woman's face made it all worthwhile. "You're very welcome," Elijah replied. "I'm glad I could help." The woman clutched the wallet to her chest, as if it were her most prized possession, her entire being relieved of a heavy weight. Elijah felt a wave of satisfaction. It was moments like this, small, quiet acts of kindness, that made the world feel a little less daunting. But before Elijah could say another word or turn to continue his walk, a sharp, commanding voice rang out from behind him. "Hey, you, stop right there." Elijah's body tensed, his mind racing. He turned slowly, unsure of what was happening now. Standing at the edge of the parking lot, hands on his hips, was a police officer, stocky, tall, with a stern face and a no-nonsense demeanor. The officer's eyes were locked on Elijah with a fierce intensity. "Who do you think you are, picking up things off the street?" The officer barked, his voice clipped. "What business do you have here?" Elijah blinked, confused. "I just helped this woman find her wallet. She lost it, and I found it for her." The officer narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing Elijah with skepticism. "Aha, and how do I know you didn't steal it in the first place?" Elijah's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" "I helped her, just like I said." The officer's expression hardened. "Listen, you don't get to walk around here acting like a hero. We've got a situation on our hands, and I don't need you interfering with a police investigation." Before Elijah could respond, the officer moved swiftly toward him, grabbing his arm in a vice-like grip. Elijah's body stiffened as the officer's fingers dug into his skin, the sensation sharp and unpleasant. "I said, you're coming with me," the officer growled. Elijah's pulse quickened, and his mind raced. This was escalating quickly, too quickly. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why was he being treated like a criminal? His instincts told him to push back, but experience told him that pushing back could make things worse. He had to stay calm, keep the situation from spinning out of control. "I'm not going anywhere," Elijah said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not some criminal." The officer didn't care. His grip tightened, and he began dragging Elijah toward the small courthouse building that loomed in front of them. "Yeah, we'll see about that," the officer sneered. "Let's get you inside and sort this out. You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself in front of the judge." Elijah's mind raced. The situation had gone from bewildering to alarming in a matter of seconds. He tried to make sense of it. Was this some kind of mistake, or was there something deeper going on? As they neared the entrance of the courthouse, Elijah could feel the eyes of the pedestrians around them. Some watched with curiosity, others with a quiet disbelief. None of them spoke up. None of them intervened. It was as if they had seen this before. The same story, the same injustice. Elijah couldn't help but feel a deep, gnawing sense of isolation. What was it about him? Was it because of his skin color? Or was it something else entirely? When they finally entered the building, the officer shoved Elijah into a small holding room, its walls cold and sterile. The officer didn't say a word as he left, leaving Elijah alone with his thoughts. Elijah sat down on the uncomfortable metal chair, trying to steady his breathing. He had no idea what was going on, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just a simple case of mistaken identity. And as he sat there in the dim, sterile room, Elijah's mind continued to race, trying to make sense of everything that had just unfolded. The truth, he knew, was not far behind. And when it came to light, the officer and everyone else would learn something they never expected. The unfolding truth. Elijah sat in the cold, sterile holding room, his hands resting loosely in his lap. The only sound in the small space, the distant echo of footsteps from the courthouse corridors. His thoughts swirled like a storm. He had been dragged into this without any clear explanation, treated like a criminal when all he had done was help an elderly woman find her lost wallet. The confusion gnawed at him, and frustration bubbled under his calm exterior. He had encountered injustice before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him. It felt personal, like someone was using their power to make a point at his expense. Elijah had worked hard all his life to get where he was, a respected public defender in the city, someone who had earned the trust of his community. He was proud of his work, of standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. This was an affront to everything he had worked for, and it made his blood boil. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, the door to the room creaked open. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped inside, his presence commanding and unyielding. Elijah looked up, surprised by the sudden change in atmosphere. This officer was different from the one who had grabbed him in the parking lot. His uniform was slightly more polished, his posture straighter, his expression more composed. "Elijah Carter?" the officer asked, his voice calm but firm. Elijah nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes. What's going on here? Why am I being detained?" The officer glanced at the paperwork in his hand before meeting Elijah's eyes with a somewhat sympathetic expression. "I'm Officer Montgomery. I'm going to get to the bottom of this, but first, I need you to stay calm. What you're about to hear might be hard to believe." Elijah frowned, his suspicion growing. "What do you mean by that?" Officer Montgomery paused, clearly weighing his words before continuing. "You're being held under suspicion of theft. But I need you to understand something. This is not about the wallet." Elijah blinked in confusion. "Then what is this about?" The officer sighed deeply, his gaze flickering to the door as if to ensure they weren't being overheard. He lowered his voice. "This goes deeper than a simple misunderstanding. The officer who arrested you, Whitaker, he's under investigation for a string of misconduct complaints. But there's more. His actions today, they've put him in a very bad position." Elijah's pulse quickened. "So you're telling me this has nothing to do with me?" "Not directly," Officer Montgomery said. "But the way you were treated, the way Whitaker dragged you into the courthouse like this, it's part of something much bigger. Something much more significant than just you or him." Elijah's brow furrowed in disbelief. He had expected the officer to explain a mistake, a misunderstanding, maybe even a way to clear his name quickly. But what Montgomery was suggesting was far more complicated. "What exactly do you mean?" Elijah asked, his voice laced with frustration. He was used to dealing with complex legal cases, but this was beginning to feel like something far beyond the norm. The officer took a seat across from Elijah, folding his hands on the table. "There's an ongoing internal investigation into Whitaker's behavior, but that's not the reason you're being detained. The real problem is who you are, Elijah." Elijah stiffened, his body suddenly tense. "Who I am?" Montgomery nodded, his face unreadable. "Yes. You see, Whitaker didn't recognize you when he first arrested you, but he will soon. He's going to learn that you're not just any man off the street. You're someone who holds an incredibly powerful position in the justice system, a position that will make him wish he'd never laid a hand on you." A chill ran down Elijah's spine as he began to understand. "You're talking about my position as chief federal prosecutor, aren't you?" Montgomery's eyes flickered with surprise, though he quickly masked it. "Yes, exactly. I don't know if Whitaker knows that you're not just a public defender in this town, but he's going to find out very soon. The arrest, the way he treated you, it's all going to come back to him. And it won't be pretty." Elijah felt a strange mix of disbelief and anger. Of course, he had risen to this position through years of hard work and dedication, but now it seemed that his title had put a target on his back. He wasn't just any man. They had assumed he was another black man to push around, another name they could abuse without consequence. "Why didn't you stop Whitaker sooner?" Elijah asked, his voice strained but controlled. Montgomery's expression darkened. "We tried, but Whitaker is, well, he's become difficult to manage. His behavior's been an issue for months now, and no one has been able to rein him in. He's dangerous, and the way he handles people, especially people of color, it's a problem. But it's not just about him. You're being dragged into something that might be much bigger than either of us." Elijah felt a surge of anger rising within him. He was being punished, dragged into a scandal because of a mistake someone else made. I've worked my entire life to get where I am, to make sure people like me, people who've been pushed to the margins, have a chance to be heard in court. And now, because of him, I'm going to be caught in the middle of his mess. Montgomery leaned forward, his voice lowering. I understand your frustration, but I need you to stay calm. You're not just any prosecutor, Elijah. You hold a key position in the federal government. This isn't just a case of racial profiling. There's a bigger scheme at play here, and if Whitaker doesn't realize who you are soon, it could spell disaster for him. Elijah tried to steady his breathing, trying to make sense of the situation. He had worked tirelessly to prove himself, to make sure he wasn't seen as just another statistic. He had fought every step of the way to ensure that his credentials and his character spoke for themselves. But now, all of that seemed to have been swept aside by a single thoughtless action. How long do you think it will take for Whitaker to realize who I am? Elijah asked, his tone clipped. Montgomery hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. I'm not sure. But when he finds out, it's going to hit him hard. And there's no way he's going to walk away from this without facing consequences. People are going to notice. Your colleagues, his superiors, they'll find out about this. It's going to be a matter of time before he learns that he messed with the wrong person. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, thick with tension. Elijah could feel the shift in his own mind, from confusion to a cold, simmering resolve. He wouldn't let this stand. He wouldn't let Whitaker's ignorance ruin everything he had worked for. Just as he was about to speak, the door to the room opened once more. This time, it wasn't Officer Montgomery. It was Whitaker himself. The officer strode into the room, his face red with anger, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The moment his eyes locked onto Elijah's, he froze, his expression shifting from one of authority to one of shock and recognition. You? Whitaker's voice trailed off as the realization dawned on him. You're Elijah Carter. Elijah stood up slowly, his body tense but his demeanor calm. He looked Whitaker dead in the eye, a quiet confidence emanating from him. Yes, I am, Elijah said, his voice steady. And you've just made a very big mistake. Whitaker's face paled as the weight of the moment crashed down on him. He had arrested the wrong person, dragged him through the courthouse, and now, Elijah Carter, the chief federal prosecutor, was standing in front of him, ready to expose everything. The officer's bravado faltered. His grip on the situation slipped. He had underestimated Elijah, and now he was about to face the consequences of his ignorance. Elijah's eyes never left Whitaker's. You've underestimated me, Officer Whitaker, and you've made a serious error in judgment. But I assure you, this won't end the way you think. The silence in the room was deafening. The tension was palpable. Elijah knew this was only the beginning, and whatever happened next, it would change everything. The aftermath of the mistake. The air in the room felt thick with a combination of tension and anticipation. Officer Whitaker's face, once flushed with arrogance, was now drained of color as he stood frozen before Elijah. The realization that he had just arrested a man he had no idea was the chief federal prosecutor of the United States hit him like a ton of bricks. Elijah, on the other hand, remained calm and composed, his mind racing, calculating the next move, even as his heart beat fast with anger and resolve. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Whitaker's jaw clenched as he struggled to find the right words, his previous bravado gone. Elijah stood still, his posture confident, yet his thoughts were carefully constructing the strategy that would not only clear his name, but possibly expose the rot within the very system that had brought him here. Finally, Officer Whitaker spoke, his voice faltering at first. You're the chief federal prosecutor. Why didn't you? He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Elijah met his gaze, and for a brief moment, let the silence linger. Why didn't I do what, officer? Elijah's voice was calm, but had an edge to it. Why didn't I announce my position when you first laid your hands on me? Why didn't I try to use my power to escape the situation you thrust me into? Because that's not the way I work. I don't let people get away with injustice simply because they're in a position of power. Whittaker swallowed hard. The embarrassment was written all over his face. His arrogance, his assumption that Elijah was just another black man, someone he could bully and humiliate, had led him to this moment. He had been completely unaware of the gravity of his actions. The room felt smaller as he realized the enormity of his mistake. "Officer Whittaker," Elijah began again, his voice low but firm. "I've spent my entire career fighting for justice. I've seen people like you, who abuse the power they're given, and it sickens me. You don't get to drag someone through the mud simply because you think you can. I'll make sure the people who need to know about your actions do. This will not go unnoticed." Whittaker's expression twisted with both confusion and fear. He had no idea how to handle this. The chief federal prosecutor, the very person whose name he had probably crossed in countless cases throughout his career. Whittaker had no idea the depth of trouble he was about to be in. It was becoming increasingly clear that his career might be over before he had the chance to realize it. The realization hit him hard. He was dealing with someone who held immense power, someone whose actions had the potential to bring down not just his own reputation, but the very foundation of the department he worked for. "I'm sorry," Whittaker muttered, the words leaving his mouth as a feeble attempt at damage control. "I didn't know who you were. I acted impulsively. It won't happen again." Elijah looked at him with cold indifference. "Sorry doesn't cut it, officer. Not after what you put me through. What you've done to me doesn't just affect me. It's a reflection of your system. A system that's supposed to serve and protect the people. You've shown me exactly how far that system can go when it's allowed to operate unchecked. You think a sorry is going to make up for all that?" Whittaker flinched under Elijah's unwavering gaze. He had been used to a different kind of confrontation, one where apologies could smooth things over, where authority and status could give him the upper hand. But now, the tables had turned, and he found himself facing someone who was not only more powerful than him, but morally unyielding. He was trapped by his own actions, caught in a web of his own making. The door to the holding room opened again, and Officer Montgomery entered, his eyes immediately assessing the atmosphere. He didn't need to ask what was going on. The room told him everything. Whittaker was visibly shaken. Elijah stood tall and resolute, and the weight of the situation was pressing down on all of them. "Montgomery," Whittaker said, his voice shaky, "you've got to understand. This wasn't intentional. I didn't know who he was. I was just doing my job." His words were desperate now, as though he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Montgomery's gaze flickered to Elijah, and then back to Whittaker. He could see the guilt and fear in Whittaker's eyes, and he knew the officer's career was hanging by a thread. "Whittaker," Montgomery said calmly, his voice carrying an undeniable weight, "you've crossed a line. You didn't just arrest this man. You've humiliated him, in front of a crowd no less. Now you're going to have to deal with the consequences. You've made a powerful enemy today." Elijah didn't speak immediately. Instead, he focused on Montgomery, his eyes narrowing slightly, sizing up the officer. "So, what now?" Elijah asked. "You let Whittaker walk away with a slap on the wrist, and then what? Is that what happens when a person in power misjudges someone based on their race? You think you can smooth this over with a few words?" Montgomery looked at him, silently assessing the depth of Elijah's anger. "No, Elijah, I'm not suggesting that. But we have to handle this carefully. Whittaker's actions are going to be investigated. You have your position in the justice system, and I have mine. This isn't just about making him apologize and walking away. There are bigger things at play here. We need to make sure the right people are held accountable." Elijah met Montgomery's gaze and nodded slowly. He wasn't ready to let Whittaker off the hook so easily. The man had tried to strip him of his dignity. humiliate him in front of others, and for that, there would be consequences. But Elijah understood the bigger picture. He knew that this was bigger than just one corrupt officer. It was about the system that allowed him to continue his abuse without facing real consequences. "You're right," Elijah said, his tone measured. "This isn't just about me. It's about everything he represents, everything that's broken in the system." Whitaker's actions were just one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot more to uncover, and I won't stop until it's all brought to light. Montgomery nodded, his expression turning grim. "I'll make sure that happens. But you need to be prepared, Elijah. This won't be easy. There are people in high places who are going to try to protect him. We both know how this game is played." Elijah's lips curled into a tight smile, his eyes narrowing with determination. "I've been playing this game for years, Officer Montgomery. I know how it works. But this time, it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure the right thing is done. And I will not back down." With that, Montgomery left the room, leaving Elijah alone with his thoughts once again. Elijah had always been a man who believed in justice above all else, but now that belief was put to the ultimate test. Whitaker's arrest had been an injustice, but Elijah wasn't going to let it be the end of the story. He was going to make sure it was just the beginning. As the door clicked shut, Elijah stood tall, his mind focused on the battle ahead. This wasn't just about exposing one bad cop. It was about bringing accountability to a system that had a lot of power to be misused time and time again. And Elijah Carter wasn't going to rest until that system was changed. The wheels were in motion now. The real fight was about to begin. And Elijah was ready. The hidden network. The following week was a blur of legal maneuvering, investigations, and behind-the-scenes power struggles. Elijah Carter's phone rang incessantly, but he answered only the calls that mattered. His position as the chief federal prosecutor gave him access to a network of individuals who were prepared to help him dismantle the layers of corruption within the justice system. While he was dealing with the immediate fallout from Officer Whitaker's actions, he knew this was a much larger issue that stretched far beyond one rogue cop. Elijah spent hours in his office, reviewing reports, discussing the case with trusted colleagues, and quietly strategizing how to expose the entrenched network of systemic injustice that had allowed officers like Whitaker to act without consequence. He knew that in order to achieve lasting change, he needed to go after more than just Whitaker. The rot ran much deeper. Whitaker was only a symptom of a much bigger problem. As Elijah sat at his desk late one evening, his assistant, Karen, knocked lightly on the doorframe and entered. "You've got a visitor, Mr. Carter," she said. "A former colleague from the Justice Department. Says it's urgent." Elijah looked up, surprised. "Who is it?" "Detective Lucas Gray. He's here to discuss something about the case." Elijah paused for a moment, his gaze intense. "Send him in." Detective Gray entered the office with a grim expression. The two men had worked together on several cases during Elijah's early years in the legal field, but they had lost touch in recent years as their careers took different paths. Gray was an investigator in the Special Investigations Unit, a department tasked with looking into corruption within law enforcement. Elijah knew that Gray had seen it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But if he was coming to Elijah now, it meant the situation had reached a breaking point. "Good to see you, Elijah," Gray said, his voice low, his face weathered by years of working on high-stakes cases. He sat down across from Elijah, his eyes scanning the room. "I know you've been busy with the Whitaker case, but there's something you need to see." Elijah leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What is it, Lucas?" Gray pulled out a manila envelope from his bag and placed it on the desk. "This," he said, "is bigger than you think. I've been investigating a network of officers and officials who've been covering up abuses like Whitaker's for years. It's not just one department. It's not just one city. It's all over the country. And I've got the proof." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a shiver down his spine. The injustice, the systemic abuse of power, It was more widespread than he had ever imagined. Gray opened the envelope and pulled out several photographs, laying them on the desk in front of Elijah. The images showed police officers in various states of misconduct, beating suspects, planting evidence, and engaging in corrupt activities with local criminals. There were also documents, confidential reports, and wiretap transcripts that revealed an intricate network of officers involved in illegal activities, ranging from bribery to the destruction of evidence. The names of high-ranking officials, both in law enforcement and politics, were scattered throughout the materials. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," Gray said, his voice tense. "I've been digging into it for months, trying to connect the dots. Whitaker's arrest was just a catalyst for me to go deeper. This network involves people in power, Elijah, people you might not even suspect. I've got the names of judges, local politicians, and even a few high-ranking members of the Department of Justice who've been turning a blind eye to these crimes. Whitaker, he's just one cog in the wheel. But his mistake, that's the crack that's going to bring everything down." Elijah stared at the photographs, his mind racing as he processed the magnitude of what Gray was telling him. The implications were staggering. For years, the system Elijah had fought so hard to protect and reform had been systematically abused by those who were supposed to uphold the law. It wasn't just a matter of bad cops. It was a systemic failure, a culture of corruption that had been allowed to fester under the surface. "I can't do this alone, Lucas," Elijah said finally, his voice steady but filled with determination. "This goes beyond Whitaker. This goes all the way to the top. I need to expose this, but it has to be done right. If we're not careful, we'll lose everything." Gray nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I know. That's why I came to you. I've got the evidence, and I'm ready to help you bring these people down. But we need to be strategic. We can't go public with this yet. If we do, they'll bury it before it even sees the light of day. We need to build a case that's airtight." Elijah's mind was already working at full speed. He knew how the game was played in Washington. DC power and influence could easily crush anyone who threatened the status quo. But he also knew that the people he was up against were not invincible. They were flawed, just like Whitaker. They could be exposed. They could be taken down. And he was going to be the one to do it. "I've got connections," Elijah said, standing up and pacing the room. "We'll bring in the right people, people who aren't afraid to go after the powerful. I'll get the Attorney General involved, but we need to have a rock-solid case first. No room for mistakes. If we move too fast, they'll shut us down." Gray stood up as well, his face determined. "I'll gather more intel. We need to trace every connection, every document, every piece of evidence. I've already reached out to a few people who can help us with the tech side of things. We'll need to tap into secure channels if we're going to keep this under wraps until the time is right." Elijah nodded. "Good. Do whatever it takes, but don't make any mistakes. I'll make the calls. We've got one shot at this. Lucas, let's make it count." The two men locked eyes, the weight of their shared responsibility settling between them. They both knew that this mission wasn't just about saving their careers. It was about saving the justice system itself, the very institution that had been corrupted, manipulated, and abused by those who were meant to protect and serve. As Gray left the office, Elijah stood alone in his quiet, dimly lit room. He stared at the evidence on his desk, the faces of corrupt officers, the names of politicians, the lists of high-ranking officials who had sold out their oath for personal gain. His hands clenched into fists, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just going to expose the truth. He was going to tear down the entire network, brick by brick, until the foundation of corruption was completely destroyed. This was war, and Elijah Carter was prepared to fight until the bitter end. The quiet before the storm. The days following the discovery of the corruption network were filled with high-stakes meetings, quiet phone calls in dark corners, and hours of laborious work behind closed doors. Elijah Carter knew that the next move had to be calculated. One false step, one slip-up, and the entire operation could implode. His office had become a war room, with multiple screens, legal papers scattered across his desk, and constant communication with the few people he trusted in the Justice Department. The air was thick with urgency, but also an unspoken understanding that this wasn't just a matter of securing a conviction or putting away a few rogue officers. This was about an entire system, a system that, at its core, had failed its most vulnerable citizens. Lucas Gray had been working tirelessly with his team, investigating every lead, tracing every piece of evidence. They were working from the shadows, operating in the dark corners of the law enforcement world, where their moves had to be secretive and precise. But Elijah knew that they were running out of time. The longer they took to gather the evidence, the more likely it was that the powerful individuals behind the corruption would realize that their web of deceit was starting to unravel. Their silence, however, was more deafening than anything else. Elijah hadn't spoken to his wife, Maya, about what was happening. He couldn't. The stakes were too high, and telling her would only put her in danger. But he knew that if he was going to go after the system, he had to put everything on the line. It was the cost of doing what he had sworn to do: protect justice, no matter the personal cost. Still, the weight of it all settled heavily on his shoulders, and every day that passed without sharing the truth with her made him feel more isolated. That morning, he stepped into the courthouse, greeted by the hum of activity as usual. The hallways were filled with lawyers, clerks, and staff hurrying to and fro, all oblivious to the storm Elijah was about to bring down upon them. He was calm outwardly, but inside, his heart was racing. There was no going back now. As he entered the courtroom for a meeting with his deputy, Sarah, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Lucas. "We've found something big. Whitaker's connections go deeper than we thought. He's tied to multiple high-profile cases. We need to meet ASAP." Elijah's pulse quickened. This was the break he'd been waiting for. He quickly responded, telling Lucas to meet him at the diner on the corner, one of the few places where they could speak freely without being overheard. As he sat down at the corner booth, the weight of the case pressing on him like a 1,000-pound weight, Elijah felt his breath catch in his chest. The diner was quiet, too quiet. He glanced at the door, checking for any signs of trouble, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Minutes later, Lucas slid into the booth, his face tight with stress. "We found a direct connection between Whitaker and the city's most influential crime syndicates," Lucas said, his voice low and urgent. "Whitaker wasn't just some corrupt cop. He's a pawn in a much larger game. And the game is bigger than we thought. We've got proof that Whitaker has been acting as a liaison between the department and these criminal networks. He's been feeding them information, protecting them, covering up their operations in exchange for cash and power." Elijah sat back, stunned. He'd known that the officer was corrupt, but this was something far more insidious. Whitaker had been embedded in a criminal enterprise, operating with impunity, unchecked for years. The implications were staggering. "Elijah, this isn't just a few rogue officers. This is systemic. This is organized crime with the full backing of law enforcement. And it's been going on for decades," Lucas continued. "The officers involved, they're not just acting on their own. They're getting their orders from the very top. Judges, politicians, people who run this city. And Whitaker's just the tip of the iceberg. We've got names, powerful names. And the deeper we dig, the more we find. If we expose all of this, we're going to need more than just a courtroom to bring them down. We're going to need backup. Big backup." Elijah could feel the weight of Lucas' words settling over him. This was bigger than he had imagined, bigger than he had ever dreamed. The corruption ran deeper than any of them had suspected. If they moved too quickly, if they exposed everything all at once, they might not survive it. The people involved were too powerful, too well connected. "We'll take it slow," Elijah said, his voice firm with resolve. "We're not going public yet. We keep working from the inside, gathering more evidence. We don't act until we have everything we need to bring down the whole operation. And when we move fast. No one gets a chance to cover their tracks. Lucas nodded, the weight of the task clearly on his shoulders. I'll keep pushing, Elijah. I'll get the rest of the team in place. But we need to be careful. We've already had some close calls. If they know we're onto them, we could be dead before we get the chance to make an arrest. Elijah's mind raced as he processed the next steps. He had to keep the investigation under wraps. The stakes were too high to make any sudden moves. The powerful individuals who ran this criminal network would do anything to protect themselves. And Elijah, a prosecutor, was now standing at the precipice of an epic battle, one where the price of failure could mean losing not just his career, but his life. I'm going to need more resources, Elijah said after a long pause. I'll make some calls to Washington, see if I can get federal support. We're going to need all the help we can get, and we can't trust anyone outside this room. No one. If the wrong person gets wind of what we're doing, it's over. The two men exchanged a look, both understanding the gravity of the situation. They were up against a force much larger than they had anticipated, but they also knew that exposing this corruption was the only way to restore the integrity of the justice system. If they succeeded, they would change everything. Forever. But the risks were monumental. Elijah's thoughts drifted to Maya again, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to think about the personal cost of all of this. He had been so focused on the mission, so consumed with bringing these criminals to justice, that he had pushed everything else aside. His family, his life outside of work. But if he didn't win this battle, if he failed, everything would be lost. Everything he'd worked for. Everything he believed in. I'll keep my ear to the ground, Lucas said, breaking his reverie. We'll gather what we can without drawing attention. But time is running out, Elijah. We can't afford to wait too long. Elijah nodded. I know. We'll act when we're ready. And when we do, we bring the full weight of the law down on them. No mercy. As the two men parted ways, Elijah felt a surge of adrenaline. He had already crossed a line. There was no turning back. This fight was now personal. The truth was out there, and he was the one who was going to expose it, no matter the cost.